All right, so I'm really glad to be here today. It's always nice to have an opportunity to share some of my research, and hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion after. So I'm going to talk about people displaced by conflict that are in Chocó, and my research has focused on, I interviewed more women than men, but it was on people generally who were displaced in Choc Colombia. I did 50 interviews, and I did those in 2014, which now seems like a really long time ago. But it was before the peace agreement had been signed, and so, but it wasn't too far before, so it was a very interesting time in the history of Colombia and in the history of the department. So I did semi-structured interviews with them, and 41 of the people that I spoke with were displaced by conflict, and 9 were key informants, just so you kind of have an idea of where I'm coming from. And so I just thought that this would be a good opportunity to share some of the stories, share some of the experiences. Today I'm going to focus, my research focused on symbolic justice and also on material forms of justice, but today I'm going to focus on material forms of justice because it's a very pressing issue. It was a very pressing issue, and it still is for my participants, and I think for the context of Chocó, as I'll describe in a moment, it is the most relevant right now. So I'm going to focus on that, and let's get to it. Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of an overview of Colombia for those who may not be familiar. And so Colombia has a long history of violence, and it can go back as far as colonization. You see indigenous people that were suppressed and kicked off their land, and you see a lot of slavery happening. So it goes back to that period. A lot of people start, when they talk about the history of Colombia, they start with a period known as La Violencia, and that was a period from 1946 to 1958. And it was marked by severe political rivalry between two groups, and there was a lot of people that died, thousands and thousands of people that died, and many people were displaced. So a lot of people started there, sort of the modern history of Colombia. And in 2016, there were 7.4 million people that were displaced by conflict in Colombia. So just to give you an idea, that's more people than at that time in Syria or Iraq. So it's a lot of people. And people have been displaced for years and years and years. So there was, when I was doing my research, there was ongoing displacements happening, and then there were people that had been there for had been kind of settled in a new community for many years. I just said that. Okay, so the Colombian context is, you will hear this if you read any articles that are talking about Colombia. They always say it's very, very complex. It's very, very complex. There are many stakeholders. There's multiple guerrilla groups, multiple paramilitary groups. There's multiple actors in the state. There's different communities. There's Afro-Colombians. There's indigenous communities. There's other Métis communities. So there's a lot of different communities that are affected, and it differs very significantly geographically. And there's also a lot of business interests, because Colombia, a lot of the places where there's a lot of conflict, there's also a lot of resources, agriculture or logging and mining being 3 of the big ones. And the conflict has been characterized by inequality and political participation. And what I'm referring to specifically here is there's been actually repression of certain groups. So if you are seen to affiliate historically and in present day in some areas with a leftist leaning group, then you'd be stigmatized, your family might be terrorized. There was an active effort to have people that had certain political views, unions that were affiliated with unions, to not participate in the political process. And they just didn't, a lot of poor communities just didn't have the opportunity because of how the system worked, and also because of aggression, to have adequate, or maybe sometimes even any, political representation. There's also a big inequality in terms of means and opportunities, and so I'm speaking specifically about material conditions here. So in Colombia, it has one of the highest levels in the world of income inequality and also of land inequality. So the distribution of land is very unequal. So let's continue on here. So let me give you a little bit of a context, so how Chocó sort of fits into that overall picture. And they have a population of about 500,000 people, and it's very isolated both geographically and culturally. So there's a mountain range, so to get to Chocó, a lot of people have to fly in. It's not an easy place to get to. You could drive in, but it would take a really long time, and at the time the roads weren't safe because they weren't maintained well, and because there was a lot of armed groups in the area. So I was really interested in it because I have done work in other parts of West Africa, and so I was really interested in how the Afro culture was manifest in Colombia, and Chocó is kind of unique because they have 82% of the population is Afro-Colombian, and 12% is indigenous. So, and overall, in the overall population, just to give you a comparison, the Afro-Colombian population is about 11% of Colombian society, and the indigenous are 3.5. So there's a high concentration of these minority groups that are in this department. And the main industries are forestry, fishing, agriculture, animal husbandry, mining, and logging. So it's a very rural environment. It's not very well developed in terms of infrastructure and services. And 68% of the people live in poverty. So that's the highest in the country. And if Chocó itself was a country, it would be one of the poorest in the world. So the conflict came from outside, and this is something that a lot of people emphasize. They said, well, we lived in peace. We had a lot, people were living in the forest. They were very isolated communities. There's a network of rivers, and there were these little communities that were all around Chocó, and they didn't have a lot of conflict, but the paramilitary groups and the guerrilla groups moved in from outside as they were pushed out of other areas, and as gold became a more valuable commodity that was available in Chocó. And so those communities that were scattered, they don't have a lot of infrastructure, they don't have services, they don't have basic education, they don't have medical services, and it can be really far for people to access those services. The capital city is Quibdó. It has a population of about 150,000, and that is where I did my research. So people had been displaced to there, and I spoke with people that were in the capital. And over 50% of the population in Quibdó identify as victims of the conflict. And that is likely an underestimation because a lot of people were afraid to declare themselves as victims. It wasn't so much about stigma necessarily, but it was about actually being afraid because they had gone through traumatic experiences and they didn't trust the government. They didn't trust the services. They thought that they would be victimized further. So this is an aerial view of Quibdó, the capital city, and I just like to show it to sort of like give you a sense, like there's mountains over here, and this is the airport. You can see the runway, and that's it. And so if you are a visual person, for me I am, I like to think of a lot of the people that are displaced and that were being newly displaced, they would they would be like on the outskirts. So especially in this area here. So in the center, you know, people who had been living there longer, there were nicer communities, there's services, electricity, running water, but as you get further out, there was less and less likely to be services, and people would just be squatting on land. So let's dive into what some material forms of inequality were that people that had been displaced experienced. So I think the most obvious and the most pressing for people was that they lost their property and they lost their land. There'd been a lot of people that had had houses, and they had had maybe businesses, and they had things that they just had to give up and leave. And they lost their way of life because of that. Maybe they were miners or they were loggers, and then they moved to Quibdó and there weren't opportunities in those fields anymore, so they didn't have the skills that were needed to be able to get a job when they moved. And a lot of them suffered physically. I mean, many people died, and a lot of people were in such difficult situations that they contracted diseases, they had injuries from experiencing violence, or the trauma of having to leave, you know, caused injuries. Maybe if they were going through the jungles and they didn't have the proper shoes, they didn't have the proper clothes, they could have injuries that way as well. And then, of course, many suffered emotionally, and this was a big issue amongst participants, which I will talk about in a little bit more detail after. So the first thing I want to talk, one of the top priorities for participants was education. And it had 3 elements. First they discussed the need for elementary and high school education. It was supposed to be free for displaced children, but that didn't always happen. And one participant explained it this way. Oh, I thought I had the quote on here. No. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. This is my overview. So I'm going to talk about these: education, employment, housing, and physical and emotional health as forms of justice. So education. So elementary and high school education. So one participant said this: education for the children, because although many schools say they are free, they give displaced victim children many problems, because you have to pay for their tuition in several schools when they are studying. And supposedly there are programs where displaced children are given uniforms and everything. And no, here with some, that does not happen. You hear about those programs, but they do not really reach the victims. Another priority area was higher education, such as college or university studies for people. And the third priority area in terms of education was capacity building and training, and for adults. So many, as I mentioned before, many of the people who had been displaced lost their livelihoods. They didn't necessarily have skills. Many people couldn't read or write. They couldn't write a resume. They couldn't read if there was maybe a job posting. They didn't have some basic skills, and people wanted maybe to learn a trade or learn some skills in construction that could get them a job. And so one of the other priority areas was employment and income. So one participant described the situation this way. They said, justice has to begin by people having subsistence, having work, food, education, clothes. If the government is seeking peace and doesn't seek a way to solve the need for work, a way to sustain families, nothing happens. The same people go back to the bush, and yes, they do worse. So there were many obstacles to people getting employment if they were a displaced person, and one would be discrimination and stigma. A lot of people that were displaced were made fun of, and they were seen to be, you know, not a bad part of society by the people in Quibdó that weren't displaced. At least that is what was communicated to me by many of the participants. So, and a lack of relevant skills, of course, and a lack of opportunities. There weren't, even if people had skills, there weren't a lot of jobs. There weren't a lot of decent jobs. There weren't a lot of good paying jobs available in Quibdó. So another material form of justice and a priority area for the participants was housing. And like I had said earlier, prior to displacement, many people had homes and land. So they moved and they had nothing, and some people, they were living in tents. A lot of people were living with relatives, and they had inadequate housing. They had a lack of running water. There was a lack of space. The houses were poorly built, and people were forced to live in bad neighborhoods where there was more violence, more conflict happening, and high crime rates, and there was gang activity. So the programs, there are programs in Colombia, and there are programs specifically in Chocó for housing, but they're not sufficient. And describing one of these programs, a participant said, "There are many limitations with the laws and programs of the government. They should be made more flexible for the displaced population. The requirements for the housing funding are that the house is not in a high-risk area, that the house has 3 rooms, bathroom, kitchen, living room, that it is made of cement, and that it has a public deed that is up to date. Money with this type of specification is extremely difficult to use." And this is because there was a certain amount of money that the government would give you to build a house, but it wasn't enough to actually meet the specifications that were required of them. Another form of material justice is physical and emotional health. And physical health was important because people had experienced trauma, they had diseases, they had injuries because of being displaced and because of living in very poor living conditions. And people have also had emotional trauma because they'd been through violent displacement, and they'd lost loved ones, they'd witnessed atrocities, they'd had to adjust to a new culture in a new environment, because the culture in Quibdó was very different than the rural communities, and it was hard to do those things. One participant put it this way: "I'm going to study psychology because there are people that face these difficulties, and they do not have the support of a person with more experience. They need the help of a specialist in emotional support. I like psychology because from that area I can help the people of my community emotionally, well, especially with people that have gone through trauma, have been abused, raped, with people whose rights have been violated especially." And overall, there is a lack of good quality healthcare services, whether that be physical health or emotional health. And there's a lack of resources available to access the services. So people don't have enough money to see medical professionals, or even if it's covered, sometimes they don't have money to buy medicine or the best treatment. And so that can be very difficult for people that are suffering maybe from now debilitating emotional or physical injuries. So I want to talk a little bit about vulnerability. And so all these different priority areas and all these different forms of material justice and the injustice that they're based on resulted because people were vulnerable. It was the most marginalized that were most vulnerable to displacement. So the people that were the most isolated, that had the least political representation, the least amount of funding, they didn't have money, poor communities, they were the ones that were vulnerable to being victims of the conflict. And that's the same thing I just said. And so there's larger populations. So on top of that, there's a larger problem in the department and in many regions in Colombia where there is a lot of poverty. So at the beginning, I was talking about how Chocó, there's 68% of the population is is in poverty. And there are many people that are in poverty. There are many people that live in Kibdo that are very, very poor, and they don't have the means to survive either. And there was actually a problem because some people, they would claim to be victims. So there was an office in Kibdo you could go to claim that you were a victim of the conflict, and then you were entitled to certain compensations, to a kit of maybe they'd give you food and some materials. And there were people that weren't displaced that were claiming to be displaced because they were so poor, they didn't have anything, and so they would go and claim to be displaced. And if they couldn't prove it, then they had to say, okay, give them these supplies. So that was a major issue. Well, that was an issue that kind of gets to the root of what was happening in the department, that there were these vulnerable populations, and they were the ones suffering the most, and they were the ones maybe directly from the conflict or even indirectly from the conflict, because now there's all this population that's coming in and competing with jobs, and that makes the population in Kibdo itself the most marginalized, more vulnerable, because there's less opportunities for them. There's less opportunities for them to work, to get a job. There's more violence coming in, so it's disruptive for all the vulnerable populations. And I have a few thoughts that I wanted to share and just ideas to talk about. So receiving material forms of justice, the ones that I highlighted here, does not address people's social position on a larger scale. So people they were like, we want to have education, we want to have these things because we want to have better lives. But all of these programs aren't going to touch the structures of how society works and their position relative to other people. And so education might move people up, but there's still going to be this vulnerable population. It's not changing the reality, the social reality in the department. And so that is problematic. And because poverty and inequality in extreme forms are likely to persist in places like Chocó, even though there's been a peace agreement that has happened in the country, and even though maybe some things are improving for some people, there's still extreme inequality. There's still armed groups that are in the region. And so if you're familiar a little bit with Colombia, you know that there was a deal with FARC, and it was a really big deal for the country. But there's other groups such as the ELN, and they had a strong presence in Chocó, and there's not been an agreement there. So even though a lot of media might say, Colombia's post-conflict now, well, it's not really post-conflict. Maybe some areas are, but it's more likely that there's just been a shift in how conflict is being labeled and how people are understanding conflict and talking about it in the political setting, rather than there being sort of an end to conflict. And that's because the infrastructure and material and cultural opportunities are only part of the picture. The bigger part of the picture is the corruption and power imbalances that are more pervasive and harder to address. So in Colombia, they have amazing laws. Sometimes they have the best human rights laws. Some people would argue they have the best human rights laws. They have the best environmental laws. They have the best protections for vulnerable populations on paper. But in reality, that's not what's happening. And so they can have a peace agreement, and they can have official ceremonies, and they can have these processes that are happening and that are being covered by the media, but that doesn't mean that things are really changing for the most vulnerable people that are living these day-to-day realities, and who the programs are not sufficient for, who don't have opportunities, who are still experiencing violence because now the groups say, well, we're not guerrillas anymore, we're not paramilitaries anymore, we're gangs, and or companies are hiring armed groups to protect their properties or to get people to move off the land so that they can exploit that land or that resource. So these issues don't end because there's a peace agreement. And I think, everybody has their different area of expertise, and I'm sure that that's probably something similar in a lot of different contexts, that that sounds really nice and you had a ceremony and things look good, but the underlying structures are still there and it's still moving forward, and it's harder. And I don't know that I'm not saying that I have the solution to what that is, but I'm saying that those things are still there and they're still present. And people wanted peace. I think that was very clear. Like, all the participants and even anybody that you talk to in Colombia is going to say, of course, they want peace. But people had different ideas about what life looked like. Some people wanted to go back to their communities and live in isolated communities and sort of live subsistence, and other people, they didn't want to ever go back. They wanted to have a new life, and they wanted to sort of try to join modern society and advance in a different way, and they could never go back. And so there were different visions of what people wanted, and at the end of the day, I think it's largely determined by who the most powerful actors. It's not being determined. The future of the country and the future of these populations is being determined by policymakers, by big companies, by interests it can be by armed interests in some of these areas where they still control a lot of the territory and a lot of the communities. So that's a reality that is still happening. And there's always going to be, it seems right now, there is right now anyways, a vulnerability that's going to come because people are isolated. They don't have services, they don't have access to defend themselves, and they don't have the means to, political means or economic means to promote their own interests and defend themselves and advance themselves maybe in the way that they want to, or just protect themselves so that outside influences aren't taking over their land and resources. And that is the end. So thank you very much.